For most couples, a Friday night out or a dream vacation is a chance to make memories. But for a select few, those normal routines lead to the unthinkable. Today, we're covering the 10 most disturbing couple disappearances. These baffling cases defy logic and will genuinely haunt you. If you love deep dives into the mysteries, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, lock your doors, hold your loved ones close, and let's get into it. There's a stretch of downtown Chicago that most people who don't live there never really see. It runs underneath everything. Lower Michigan Avenue, Lower Wacker Drive. It's a strange, subterranean world of concrete pillars, yellow sodium lights, disorienting ramps, and echoing tire noise. And in 1970, whole stretches of it ran right along the edge of the Chicago River with almost no guardrails. On a rainy May night, on that exact underground road, a distinctive black and yellow 1969 Oldsmobile sports coupe rolled out of a hotel parking garage with an obviously ill man behind the wheel and his frightened wife crying in the passenger seat. And then, the car, 4,000 pounds of American Detroit steel, drove into that concrete maze. And it drove out of history. 55 years later, a fleet of divers and sonar teams have combed every inch of the Chicago River and the Lake Michigan Harbor and cannot find a single bumper. This is the case of Edward and Stefania Andrews, two of the most predictable, ledger and schedule people you could ever meet. Two of the last people you'd expect to disappear off the face of the earth. Let me set the scene, because the geography here is doing most of the work. Chicago, May 15th, 1970. A Friday night. It's late spring. The weather's warming up. The Loop is packed. You're in the peak downtown Chicago of the era. A bright, loud, tightly wound urban core with cabs everywhere. Businessmen coming out of steakhouses, doormen out on the sidewalks, and the whole city humming under a canopy of neon and headlights. The Sheraton Chicago Hotel on North Michigan Avenue was one of the premier addresses in the Loop, hosting exactly the kind of cocktail parties where retirement-age professionals in suits and pearls sipped Manhattans and traded stories about their grandkids. But the second you step out of that hotel and take your car down into the parking structure, the atmosphere changes. Chicago has this genuinely bizarre multi-level street system where the main roads run at ground level, and then a whole second set of roads runs one story underneath. Lower Michigan Avenue, Lower Wacker Drive. It's not just a service road, it's a full parallel city underneath the visible one. And in 1970, the lower deck was dark, poorly lit, full of blind ramps and turns, and in certain places it ran directly next to the Chicago River, sometimes with nothing between the pavement and the water except a low curb. That is the environment Edward and Stefania Andrews drove into that night. Now, let's talk about who they were. Edward Andrews was 62 years old, a bookkeeper and manager at a company called Miller Peerless Manufacturing. Stefania Andrews, also 62, worked as a credit investigator for a loan company. Think about the personalities that gravitate to those two jobs: bookkeeping, credit investigation, ledgers, records, numbers, verification. These were meticulous, careful, deeply routine-oriented professionals. They lived in Arlington Heights, one of the quieter, more upscale suburbs northwest of the city. They had a plan. They were less than a year away from retirement. Every person who ever worked with them, lived near them, or crossed paths with them said the same thing. Edward and Stefania Andrews did not do impulsive, they did not do reckless, they did not do vanishing. They filed their taxes on time. They mowed the lawn on schedule. They were, by every possible metric, exactly the kind of people you would bet the house on to always show up when they said they would, which is what makes the events of May 15th so hard to make sense of. That afternoon, something went wrong with Edward. He had lunch, and shortly after, he started feeling really sick. Co-workers at Miller Peerless noticed. He looked pale. He looked shaky. Something had hit him hard, maybe food poisoning, maybe the flu, maybe something worse. He powered through the rest of the workday because that's the kind of guy he was. That evening, despite feeling awful, Edward and Stephania kept their plans and went into the city for a scheduled cocktail party at the Sheraton in Chicago. Multiple people at the party noticed that Edward looked genuinely unwell, pale, sweating, off. At some point during the evening, he told Stephania he was hungry and wanted to leave early and grab a real meal on the way home. Around 9:30 p.m., they said their goodnights and headed down to the parking garage. And now every eyewitness account we have starts to feel wrong. The parking garage attendant watched Edward walk toward the car and later described him as physically staggering. Not tipsy, because Edward wasn't a big drinker, but disoriented, off balance, as if something neurological was going on, something more than a stomach bug. Edward got behind the wheel of his 1969 Oldsmobile 442. This is a big, muscular, black and yellow sports coupe, distinct paint job, very recognizable car. He backed out of the space, and on the way out of the parking structure, he sideswiped the garage door. Not tapped, sideswiped. The valet came around to check on them. He looked into the passenger seat, and there he saw Stephania Andrews sitting there quietly crying. Not injured, but visibly, obviously frightened. Edward drove out. He took the Oldsmobile out onto the lower deck of Michigan Avenue, that same dark, disorienting subterranean level of Chicago I described earlier, and he immediately turned the wrong way. He drove south into the northbound lanes. The garage manager watched the black and yellow car cruise off in the wrong direction, heading straight toward the Michigan Avenue Bridge and Wacker Drive. That is the final confirmed sighting of Edward Andrews, Stephania Andrews, and the 1969 Oldsmobile 442. Ever. The next day, they didn't show up to a scheduled weekend dinner party with friends. On Monday morning, both of them missed work, Edward and Stephania both being famously never-miss-a-day people. Alarmed co-workers called police, and police used a neighbor's key to go inside the Arlington Heights house. The house looked untouched, perfectly in order. Weekend newspapers were piling up unread on the front lawn. The mailbox was overflowing. The only things missing were the specific formal clothes and jewelry Stephania had been photographed wearing at the cocktail party. They never made it home. Not that night, not any night after. All right, let's take the theories apart. Theory 1, the runaway theory. Look, some couples do just decide one day to blow up their old lives and start over. But this theory requires you to believe that Edward Andrews, a 62-year-old bookkeeper feeling so sick he could barely stand up straight, 1 year from a comfortable retirement, driving his wife home from a cocktail party, decided in that specific moment to abandon everything. To what end? He wasn't going to run off with his mistress. He wasn't fleeing debt. He wasn't a wanted man. Nothing about his financial life or his personal life suggested a secret exit strategy. And he certainly didn't sideswipe a parking garage door on his way out to freedom while his terrified wife cried in the passenger seat. That is not a getaway. That is a medical emergency. Cross it off. Theory 2, the accident. And this is the one the police went hard on for years. Their reconstruction went like this. Edward was severely ill, possibly having a stroke, a cardiac event, some kind of neurological episode. That would explain the staggering. That would explain the disorientation. That would explain sideswiping the door. That would explain driving the wrong way on Lower Michigan. And on that dark subterranean road, with visibility bad and Edward barely functioning, he attempted a U-turn, or missed a curve, or lost consciousness, and drove that big Oldsmobile straight off the edge of the road and into the Chicago River. On paper, it fits. It fits the medical picture, it fits the geography, it fits the wrong way driving, it fits the total absence of the couple after that sighting. But here's the problem. Chicago police did not just casually check the river. They ran serious, sustained recovery operations for years. Divers, deep water dragging equipment, sonar. In the summer of 1970, they worked the river hard. In 1971, they came back and did it again. In 1974, they ran additional sonar sweeps near Navy Pier, where the river empties into Lake Michigan. A veteran sonar technician went on the record saying he was 95% sure that the vehicle was not in the search area. Let that land. That is a 2-ton, 20-foot-long, distinctive black and yellow sports coupe in a specific, contained urban waterway. And extensive professional searches over multiple years returned nothing. No car, no oil slick, no floating debris, not even a piece of glass or a hubcap floating downstream. You do not accidentally drive a heavy 1969 muscle car into a river without leaving a scar somewhere. Broken guardrail, skid mark, a sheet of metal caught on a rock, something, and there was nothing. Theory 3. And this is where Chicago's very specific 1970 flavor comes into play. Edward was a bookkeeper in Chicago, in the era of Sam Giancana, in a city where certain manufacturing companies had certain connections to certain organizations, and where an accountant who saw the wrong numbers on the wrong ledger could end up as a very quiet problem to be solved. Miller Peerless Manufacturing has never been publicly tied to organized crime, but the idea floated for years. Did Edward see something? Did he cook the wrong books? Was that sudden illness actually a poisoning? Was the drive that night an ambush? The problem with the mob theory is that it does not solve the same puzzle. Even if organized crime intercepted a moving Oldsmobile in downtown Chicago at 9:35 on a Friday night, you still have the same problem. Where is the car? The whole point of a professional hit is that a bookkeeper drops dead of natural causes at his desk. You don't kidnap two people in traffic, drive their giant identifiable sports coupe somewhere, dispose of it perfectly, and hope nobody notices. And even the mob has to put the car somewhere. 50 years of federal informants, plea deals, and cold case flips have never produced a single whisper about Edward Andrews. And then there's a fourth idea that a Chicago detective floated in 1973. Maybe the car did go into the river. Maybe it sank. And then, shortly after, one of the massive commercial industrial river barges that constantly moved through downtown Chicago struck the submerged Oldsmobile, crushed it into the river bottom mud, or shoved it deep into the harbor, or pushed it out into Lake Michigan itself. It's physically possible. Barges in that stretch are enormous. Impact damage could have shredded the car into fragments and buried them in silt, which is why every subsequent sonar sweep found only mud. It's a theory that works only because there is nothing left to find. That is where the case sits, 55 years later. Edward and Stephania Andrews walked out of a well-lit cocktail party in the middle of America's third largest city. They took an elevator down to a parking garage. They got into a car so distinctive that the valet remembered it in perfect detail. Edward, obviously ill, hit the garage door on the way out. Stephania sat crying beside him, and then they drove down into the concrete underworld beneath the city, a level of Chicago that 100 people were traveling through at exactly the same moment. Not one of those people ever saw them again. No car, no bodies, no skid marks, no debris, no river bottom sonar return, no confession, no sighting in Mexico, no forwarding address in another state, just a black and yellow 1969 Oldsmobile that a garage manager watched cruise slowly, wrong way, into the darkness under Michigan Avenue. And then, somehow, in the space of a single lit block of downtown Chicago, drove right off the edge of the earth. Picture this. A major American city, not a lonely stretch of highway in Wyoming, not a foggy trailhead in the Smokies, a city of 1.5 million people with cameras on toll bridges, cops on corners, and eyes on every intersection. Two adults get into a big, loud, black pickup truck outside a crowded bar. They drive off into the snow. And then, nothing. No truck, no bodies, no cell phone pings, no credit card swipes, not a single frame of surveillance footage. It's like the street just opened up and swallowed them whole. This is the story of Richard Petrone and Danielle Imbo, and after 20 years, the FBI still can't tell you what happened on the corner of 4th and South. Let me set the scene, because the setting is half the mystery here. It's Saturday, February 19th, 2005. Philadelphia. And South Street on a normal weekend night is one of the most alive corridors on the East Coast. It's a 5-block stretch of tattoo parlors, cheesesteak joints, dive bars, live music venues, and pizza windows that stay open until 3 in the morning. Think leather jackets, cigarette smoke curling under streetlights, the muffled bass of a cover band leaking through a bar door every time somebody stumbles out. But this particular Saturday was different. A storm had rolled in, the temperature had crashed, heavy, wet snow was falling in sheets, muting the streetlights and turning the sidewalks into gray slush. The bars were still packed, sure, but the outside world had gone quiet. The kind of quiet where snow eats sound, where the neon glow of a bar sign only reaches about 10 feet before the darkness takes over. And here's the geography you need to keep in your head. South Street runs east to west. Head east for just a few blocks and you hit the Delaware River, a cold, black, freezing expanse of water. Head north or south and you've got the highways, I-95, the bridges to New Jersey. In other words, if you wanted to make a person disappear, you had water on one side and interstates on the other, and a blinding snowstorm covering everything in between. All right. So who are our two people? Richard Patrone Jr. Everybody called him Rich. He was 35 years old, a solid guy, 5'9", about 200 pounds, had an Angela tattoo on his left arm and clown tattoos on his right, if that tells you anything about his personality. He worked long, honest hours at Viking Pastries, his family's bakery out in Ardmore. But the most important detail about Rich, he was a solo dad. He was raising a 14-year-old daughter, and he had built his entire adult life around being there for her. Every single person who knew him will tell you the same thing. That kid was his world. Danielle Imbo was 34, a mortgage processor from Mount Laurel, New Jersey. She was warm, outgoing, ambitious. She was actually taking night classes to advance her career because she had one very specific dream. She wanted to save up enough money to buy a house with a grassy backyard for her son. Her 18-month-old son, a toddler. Danielle was in the middle of a separation from her husband, Joe. It was messy, like separations are, but she was navigating it. And she was crazy about that little boy. Rich and Danielle had this on-again, off-again thing, not because of drama, but because both of them were single parents whose lives revolved around their kids. Scheduling a date night when you're two exhausted parents is basically an act of God. But they'd known each other for years, and they cared about each other. Now, here's the thing I want you to lock in before we go any further. These were not runners. These were not the kind of people who faked their own deaths. They were rooted. They had toddlers and teenagers waiting for them at home. They had jobs they showed up for. They had mothers who called them every day. That matters. That matters a lot for what comes next. Okay. The night of her, Danielle had actually planned to study with a coworker that Friday. She canceled. Instead, she went out to a casual dinner with her mom, Rich's mom, and a couple of girlfriends. No secrets, no sneaking around. Everybody knew where she was. Around 9 o'clock, two of her friends drove her from dinner over to South Street. She didn't have her own car in the city. She was completely dependent on Rich for a ride back to Jersey that night. They dropped her off at a bar called Abilene at 429 South Street, where Rich was waiting. They had a drink. They laughed. Rich mentioned that a buddy of his was at another bar down the street, so the group walked over. Rich made a joke about how lucky he'd gotten with parking. He'd found a spot right around the corner, which on a snowy Saturday on South Street is basically winning the lottery. That little detail matters. It means when they left, they weren't walking half a mile through a blizzard. The truck was right there. Around 11:45 p.m., they said their goodbyes. Their friends watched them button up their coats, head out into the falling snow, and walk toward Rich's ride. It was a 2001 Dodge Dakota, black over silver, a big, heavy pickup truck, Pennsylvania plate YFH 2319. They got in, they drove away. And that is the last confirmed sighting of Richard Patrone and Danielle Imbo on this planet. The next morning, Danielle didn't show up for a hair appointment, which, if you know Danielle, is like the sun forgetting to come up. Joe Imbo tried to reach her about a custody swap for their son. Nothing. Rich's family couldn't reach him either. He wasn't at home. He wasn't at the bakery. His daughter didn't know where he was. By that afternoon, panic had set in. By the next day, the Mount Laurel police were involved. By the end of the week, the FBI had a full task force on it. And what did they find? Let me be precise about this. They found nothing. No cell phone activity after 11:45 p.m. Both phones went dark at the exact same moment and never turned back on. Not a single tower ping. No calls out, no calls in, no bank activity, no ATM withdrawals, no credit card swipes, no debit card. Not $1 moved out of any account in either of their names, that night or in the 20 years since. No Danielle's purse on the sidewalk, no shattered glass in the parking spot, no blood, no signs of struggle. And the Dodge Dakota, a 3,000-pound American-made pickup truck, gone, vanished, in an era of toll booth cameras, bridge cameras, and traffic monitors, in a truck that was, frankly, not subtle. Now, this is where we've got to stop and think, because a case like this always attracts theories, and every one of them collapses the moment you press on it. Let's press. Theory 1. The runaway theory. Maybe they just decided to leave, ditch their old lives and start over somewhere new. It's a romantic idea. It's also insane. Because here's the thing. Rich had a 14-year-old daughter he was raising by himself, and Danielle had an 18-month-old baby boy she was fighting to build a life for. You don't just walk away from an infant. You don't just leave a teenage girl to figure out life without her dad. And even if you were somehow that kind of person, you still need money. You need ID. You need a plan. But their bank accounts have sat perfectly still for 2 decades, not one penny withdrawn. So what did they do? Start a whole new life on a couple of 20s from Rich's wallet? It doesn't work. It has never worked. Not for a single investigator, not for a single family member, not for the FBI. Cross it off. Theory 2, the accident. It was snowing. The roads were slick. Maybe Rich lost control, slid off a road, plunged into the Delaware River, and the truck sank straight to the bottom. On the surface, this feels plausible. But hold on a second. To get from that parking spot on South Street to the Delaware River, you're not just drifting off the road. You're navigating a dense urban grid. Traffic lights, guardrails, concrete barriers, curbs, other cars. You would have to hit something, jump something, or blow through something. And in a city that never fully sleeps, somebody would have seen it. A cabbie, a doorman, somebody smoking a cigarette outside a bar. But even if none of that mattered, even if the truck somehow slipped silently into the river, the FBI has searched that river. Sonar, divers, cold case teams. There's even a private group called Adventures with Purpose that specializes in finding submerged vehicles, and they've been out there scanning the Delaware and the Schuylkill. They've found other missing cars. Old ones, cold cases from other decades, just not Rich's Dakota. Never Rich's Dakota. So where is it? Theory 3. The random carjacking gone wrong. A random attacker sees a nice truck, pulls a weapon, forces them to drive somewhere, commits a fatal crime, and disposes of the evidence to keep the truck. Okay. But a 2001 Dodge Dakota is not a Bentley. It's not a target vehicle. And even if you did carjack it, you have to hide it. You can chop it for parts, sure, but that leaves a paper trail. VIN numbers on parts. Somebody talks. Somebody flips. Somebody uses the plates on a different vehicle. In 20 years, in the entire eastern seaboard, not a single component of that truck has ever surfaced on the black market. And 2 bodies? 2 adults? Bodies turn up? That's just a hard, ugly fact. They wash up. They get found by hikers. They get discovered when someone renovates a basement. But Rich and Danielle? Nothing. Which brings us to Theory 4. The one the FBI actually leans toward. Contract for hire. A professional hit. The theory is that somebody paid somebody to make Rich and Danielle go away, and that somebody had the infrastructure, a chop shop, a shipping container, a hole in the ground somewhere, to make a truck and 2 bodies vanish for good. And I get it. It's the only theory that even begins to explain the completeness of the disappearance. But then you have to ask the obvious question. Who? Danielle's estranged husband, Joe Imbo, was the natural suspect. But Joe had a rock-solid alibi. He was at a party attended by a police officer. He wasn't anywhere near South Street, and beyond Joe, there was no known enemy, no obvious motive, no shady business deal, no jilted lover, no debt. Rich made pastries for a living. Danielle processed mortgages. These weren't people who lived in a world where hits get ordered. So even the FBI's best theory has this gaping hole in the middle of it. If it was a hit, who wanted them gone so badly that they were willing to pay for a 5-star, no evidence, 20-year buried professional job on 2 working-class Philadelphia parents? Nobody has an answer, and that's where the case sits today. 20 years on, Rich's daughter is a grown woman now. Danielle's son is in his 20s. They grew up without their parents, and they grew up without an ending. There's no grave to visit. There's no arrest to read about. There's not even a body of water somebody can point to and say, "That's where." There's just a corner on South Street where 2 responsible, deeply loved adults walked out of a warm, crowded bar into a freezing snowstorm, climbed into a black Dodge Dakota, and drove off the face of the earth. No skid marks, no goodbye note, no trace, just silence. And a truck that, somehow, in a city of more than 1 million people, no one has ever seen again. Here's the thing about New York City that everybody kind of knows but doesn't really think about. There are almost no truly private moments. Even at 3 in the morning, in the deepest corner of the deepest neighborhood, somebody is awake. Somebody is smoking on a fire escape, somebody's in a bodega, somebody's driving a cab. The city has eyes on itself around the clock, which is what makes the case of Michael Sullivan and Camden Sylvia so completely, maddeningly impossible. Because on a Friday night in November of 1997, in the middle of the busiest island on Earth, 2 athletic, healthy adults walked out of their front door for a jog and simply ceased to exist. No screams, no signs of an altercation on the sidewalk, no security footage, no witnesses, just an empty apartment, a hungry cat, and a landlord acting so suspiciously that police could barely keep up with him. This is one of the strangest disappearance cases in modern New York history, and it may also be one of the most obvious. Let me set the scene because in this case, the setting is the whole story. Downtown Manhattan, November 1997, Financial District. If you were around back then, you know the vibe. Late autumn in New York is a very specific atmosphere. The trees in the little pocket parks are half stripped, the wind cuts down between the skyscrapers, the light goes gray at 4 in the afternoon, and everybody starts moving with their hands buried in their coat pockets and their shoulders up around their ears. The neighborhood down around Pearl Street was already changing then, transitioning from an all-business empty-at-night district into an artsy live-work zone. Old brick buildings from the 1920s were being converted floor by floor into massive raw lofts. At 76 Pearl Street, on the top floor of one of those old brick buildings, there was one particularly beautiful loft. Big windows, exposed beams, high ceilings, art on the walls, and living in it, paying the impossible New York dream rent of about $300 a month for a space worth 10 times that on the open market, were Michael Sullivan and Camden Sylvia. Michael was 54. He was a dancer, a choreographer. He'd been working in the New York theater and modern dance world for decades, and by 1997, he was working at the new Museum of Contemporary Art up in the Bowery. Physically fit, athletic, disciplined the way lifelong dancers are. Camden was 36, originally from Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She had a fine arts degree from Hunter College. She worked in a real estate office during the day, and by night she made these beautiful, careful sculptures out of found objects, bits of metal and glass and forgotten street junk that she rescued and turned into something intentional. She was warm. She was community-minded. She was crazy about Michael, and Michael was crazy about her. And they were crazy about their loft. That $300 rent-controlled apartment was the anchor of their entire life. It was where their art lived. It was where their cat lived. It was the base of a very specific New York existence that only a very small number of lucky people ever get to have. But by the fall of 1997, that dream had a dark cloud parked directly over it. And the cloud had a name. Their landlord, a man named Robert Rodriguez, who also ran a locksmith shop out of the ground floor of the same building, had done the math. He'd realized that as long as the rent-controlled tenant stayed in place, he was, in effect, losing thousands of dollars a month per unit. His building was in one of the most rapidly gentrifying zip codes in the country. If he could just get those long-term tenants out, he could gut the lofts, jack the rents to market rate, and become a very rich man. And so, right as the New York autumn turned nasty, Rodriguez played his card. He cut the heat, or he threatened to, or he let it go out and dragged his feet fixing it. Either way, that beautiful old brick building at 76 Pearl Street became bitterly, punishingly cold. And when your landlord is trying to freeze you out of a rent-controlled apartment in the most literal possible sense, you have two choices. You can leave, or you can fight. Michael and Camden fought. They organized the other tenants. They drafted a formal rent strike petition stating that until the heat was restored on a consistent basis, nobody in the building would be paying a dime. This is a real move. Under New York tenant law, if you can prove a habitability failure, a landlord's hands are tied. On the night of November 7th, 1997, Camden personally walked that petition down to Rodriguez and handed it to him. That was the confrontation. That same evening, Michael and Camden had rented a copy of the movie Addicted to Love. And at some point that night, they laced up their running shoes, told the cat they'd be back, and went out for their usual jog through the quiet, cold financial district streets. They never came back. Nobody heard from them the next day, or the day after that. On November 13th, about 6 days later, Camden's mother drove down from Massachusetts. She was frantic. She went to Rodriguez, the landlord, and asked to be let into the loft. He let her in. And here's what she saw. The apartment was in perfect order. Not creepily staged perfect. Just lived in perfect. Fresh food was in the refrigerator. There was a bouquet of flowers sitting on the table. Wallets, both of them, were sitting inside. Passports were sitting inside. Cash was there. Credit cards were there. Keys, most of them, were there. Their cat, who they treated like a member of the family, was there, hungry and confused and waiting for its people to come home. The only things missing from that apartment were their running shoes and a single set of keys. So on paper, the answer is simple. They went out for a jog, and something happened during the jog. Except the moment you actually try to figure out what happened, the story falls apart in your hands. All right, let's take the theories one at a time. Theory 1. The runaway theory. Maybe the stress of the landlord war had gotten to be too much and they decided to blow up their lives and start over somewhere new. But hold on. Look at what they took with them. Running shoes and one set of keys. That's it. No wallets, no passports, no money, no IDs, not a single credit card, not even a change of clothes. You cannot start a new life in America in a t-shirt and sneakers. You can't rent a room, board a bus, or buy a cup of coffee without ID and cash. And more importantly, you don't walk away from your cat. You don't walk away from Camden's finished sculptures. You don't walk away from Michael's job at a museum. You don't walk away from the flowers on your own kitchen table. This theory is over before it starts. Theory 2. The random mugging that turned into a murder. 2 joggers, late at night, get caught in the wrong alley by the wrong guy, and it goes bad. Okay, but this is Lower Manhattan. Even in 1997, this is a dense, brightly lit brick and concrete grid where you cannot walk 2 blocks without passing a restaurant window, a doorman, a food cart, or somebody standing outside their building having a cigarette. 2 athletic adults get attacked hard enough to lose their lives, and nobody hears a scream, nobody sees a struggle, nobody notices a car peeling away. And then, most impossibly of all, where are the bodies? Bodies don't just evaporate, not in Manhattan, not on a jog. If they'd been mugged and killed on the street, there would be a crime scene. There isn't one. Not a drop of blood on the sidewalk, not a torn jacket in an alley, nothing. Theory 3. The landlord. Now this is where the ground starts to shift under your feet because Robert Rodriguez, the landlord, had every possible ingredient of a prime suspect. Motive. The rent-controlled apartment was costing him money every single month, and Michael and Camden had just organized a rent strike that could tie him up in tenant law for years. Opportunity. He was the landlord. He owned the whole building. He had keys to every unit, control of the elevators, and a locksmith shop on the ground floor. And his behavior after the disappearance was, to put it politely, incredibly suspicious. Rodriguez was cooperative at first, but the second police asked to search his ground floor locksmith shop, the shop, remember, where he had the tools and the private space to do just about anything, Rodriguez packed up and vanished for 14 days, 2 weeks, off the grid. He only surfaced again once he had hired himself a high-powered, mob-connected criminal defense attorney. And then, when investigative journalists started digging into his past, they found something really, really unsettling. Back in 1991, 6 years before Michael and Camden vanished, Robert Rodriguez had been involved in a nasty $13 million civil lawsuit involving stolen corporate secrets. His co-defendant, a man named David King, had disappeared before the case went to trial. Never seen again. Not in 1991. Not ever. So Robert Rodriguez was now, by any reasonable count, associated with 3 separate missing people. And then, 3 weeks after Michael and Camden vanished, police executed a search warrant on the building. In a second-floor stairwell of 76 Pearl Street, the stairwell, remember, that a jogging couple would descend to get out of the building, investigators found biological stains on a rug and evidence of an altercation on the wall. That's not a mugging out on the street. That's not a runaway to Mexico. That is an interception. Somewhere between the top-floor loft and the front door, something went badly wrong for Michael and Camden Sullivan and Sylvia. But, and here is the maddening part, there was not enough physical evidence to definitively tie the blood to them, not enough to build a homicide case, not enough to say what happened next. Where were they taken? What was done with their bodies? A basement, a vehicle, the East River? Nobody knows. And Rodriguez, of course, wasn't talking. So how do you pull off a double disappearance in a working New York City apartment building without leaving a body, without leaving a witness, and without leaving evidence a prosecutor can use? How do you take 2 athletic adults out of a stairwell and make them disappear from the island of Manhattan forever? Somebody knew, but nobody was ever going to be charged with saying so. Here's the ending, or the closest thing this case has to one. Robert Rodriguez did eventually go to prison. Not for Michael, not for Camden, not for David King. He went down on 29 counts of massive identity theft, money laundering, tax evasion, and credit card fraud. A whole architecture of financial crime that investigators uncovered while pulling on the threads of the disappearance. Which tells you something about the kind of man he was. It tells you the capacity was there. But it doesn't tell you what happened in that stairwell on the night of November 7th, 1997. And that's where the case sits, 28 years on. 2 people, a dancer and an artist, deeply in love, deeply rooted in their community, deeply anchored to a top-floor loft and a cat and a life, walked out of their front door for a jog on a cold Friday night in Manhattan. They left the wallet. They left the passport. They left the flowers on the table. And in a city of 9 million people, on an island covered in cameras and doormen and street lamps and awake, wide-eyed neighbors, they simply were not there anymore. Just an empty apartment, a hungry cat, a rent strike petition that had been delivered a few hours too late, and a stairwell 2 floors down with blood on the wall. Imagine walking into a friend's house one afternoon and finding it completely, uncannily untouched. Dishes still sitting in the sink from breakfast. A stack of dividend checks worth thousands of dollars fanned out on the kitchen counter, uncashed. Their 2 cars parked neatly in the garage. Every dress in the closet, every suit on its hanger, every suitcase up on the shelf where suitcases live. And, wandering the empty rooms crying for food, the family cat that the couple loved so much they used to feed it imported caviar. That is what William and Margaret Patterson left behind in El Paso, Texas, in the spring of 1957. They didn't run. They didn't pack. They didn't say goodbye. They just stopped being there. 67 years later, nobody has ever cracked what happened inside that house on Piedmont Avenue, and the strangest clue in the whole case didn't surface until 1984. Let me set the scene, because 1957 El Paso is a very specific flavor of American story that people don't tell much anymore. Picture the post-war West at its most muscular. El Paso in the 50s was a booming desert city, riding the Cold War economy, expanding in every direction, and sitting right on the international border with Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. That border matters. Because in 1957, crossing back and forth was casual. You could drive south for a night of drinking and be home before breakfast. People vanished into Juarez all the time and reappeared a week later with a hangover and a story. If you wanted to make a person disappear, voluntarily or otherwise, you had a whole other country sitting 15 minutes from your front door and the Chihuahuan desert stretching in every other direction as far as the eye could see. Now, layer on top of that the general atmosphere of the late Eisenhower years. There's Cold War paranoia everywhere. There's a booming middle class trying to project perfect suburban normal. There's this pressure to look like the ad in the magazine, the perfect house, the perfect wife, the perfect cocktail hour at 6. Underneath, of course, lots of families were falling apart in silence. That's the vibe we're working with: manicured lawns and rotting foundations. The Pattersons lived at 3000 Piedmont Avenue, in one of El Paso's genuinely wealthy pockets. William was 52, Margaret was 42. They ran Patterson Photo Supply, a downtown business that was grossing something like $20,000 a month, which in 1957 was an astronomical amount of money. Adjust for inflation, and you're talking about the kind of income where you're just casually rich. New cars, vacation trailers, boats, the full mid-century Texas package. But when you look closer at the couple themselves, the picture is not the picture. William was, by every account, a serial philanderer. He had at least one long-term mistress in town, a woman named Estefana, for whom he had actually purchased a Ford Thunderbird. Because a Thunderbird for the girlfriend is exactly the kind of move a wealthy 1957 businessman thought was normal. Margaret knew. Margaret was miserable. She drank heavily. She had previously survived a severe medical and mental health crisis. Her way of coping with a husband who was constantly stepping out was, essentially, to hold it together in public and slowly come apart in private. The one uncomplicated love in Margaret's life? Their cat, Tommy. Yellow and white house cat. She adored him. She fed him imported caviar. Friends and family will tell you that Tommy was, functionally, the child that this childless, unhappy marriage never had. Whatever else was going on in that house, Margaret was not going to hurt that cat. She was not going to abandon that cat. That cat was the thing. Hold that detail. March 4th, 1957. William spends the day at home in the garage doing maintenance on his personal boat. He's got 2 guys with him: David Kirkland, who managed his photo supply store downtown, and Cecil Ward, a mechanic and family friend. Normal day, good moods. They agree to pick up the boat work again the next day. March 5th. Both Kirkland and Ward have to cancel, schedule conflicts. William is at the house without his guys. That evening, a neighbor knocks on the Pattersons' door to drop off some Girl Scout cookies. And this is the moment when the story quietly tips. Because the neighbor immediately notices that something is wrong. Margaret looks upset, really upset, distracted, distant, not herself. William, meanwhile, is visibly annoyed that the neighbor is standing at his door at all, which, for a couple who normally did the whole gracious hosts thing, was strange. The neighbor left. That night, the same neighbor later reported hearing what sounded like unusual activity coming from the Patterson property. 3 in the morning. March 6th. David Kirkland, the store manager, is asleep at home when his phone rings. It's William. And William says something very specific. He says, "We're going away. I'll have to take Margaret away for a while." He tells Kirkland to swing by Cecil Ward's garage the next day because he's leaving his Cadillac there for some mechanical work. Keys will be inside. And then he hangs up. Later that same night, someone did drop off a Cadillac at Cecil Ward's garage. The keys were in the ignition, as promised, but the employee on duty took one look at the man behind the wheel and later told investigators something that stops you cold. He said the driver didn't look anything like Pat. That was March 6th, 1957, and that is the last day the Pattersons were arguably even alive. Then, the paperwork started to arrive. On March 15th, 10 days after the Pattersons vanished, the couple's business auditor, a man named Herb Roth, received a telegram. It was signed Pat, and it gave a series of very convenient, very specific business instructions. Liquidate the mobile trailer, lease the Piedmont Avenue house out for at least 9 months, put Kirkland in charge of running the photo supply business, cancel an employee's scheduled trip to a convention in Washington, D.C. That telegram, which nobody could verify was actually sent by William, became the entire basis for a slow 5-month unwinding of the Pattersons' business affairs. Property was sold, the house was leased out, Kirkland took over as manager, and nobody officially reported the couple missing until August 15, 1957, when Cecil Ward finally walked into the sheriff's office, 5 months after that 3 a.m. phone call. The following June of 1958, the couple's attorney received one more piece of paperwork, a typewritten letter postmarked from Laredo, Texas, signed Pat. The letter said William and Margaret were leaving the country permanently and would never return, and it gave detailed instructions to divide their remaining assets among their employees. Handwriting experts would later say the signature was inconclusive, and the letter had one glaring legal problem. Margaret hadn't co-signed it, which made it worthless in court. Somebody wanted the Pattersons' business empire. Somebody was writing letters to make sure they got it, and somebody was doing all of this while, back at 3000 Piedmont Avenue, a starving yellow and white house cat wandered a half-empty mansion looking for a woman who had never once forgotten to feed him. All right, let's look at the theories. Theory 1. The spontaneous getaway. A wealthy Texas couple gets a wild hare and takes off for Mexico. Except, take a real look at what they left behind. Both cars were still parked in the garage. Every stitch of clothing was still in the closets. Suitcases still on the shelves. Margaret's jewelry was in the box. Dirty dishes were rotting in the kitchen sink. Underwear and stockings were tossed across a bed like somebody was in the middle of doing laundry. And thousands of dollars in dividend checks were sitting on the counter, uncashed. If you are planning a permanent move to Mexico with your wealthy wife, you cash the checks, you pack a bag, you take the Cadillac, and most importantly, you do not walk out and leave Tommy the cat to starve. This is a woman who bought imported fish eggs for a house cat. There is no version of Margaret Patterson that leaves that animal behind by choice. The theory dies on the doormat. Theory 2. Cold War espionage. This one exploded in the late 50s because William owned a photography business, and any El Paso businessman with a camera in his hand near a military base immediately looked to a paranoid public like a possible Soviet operative. The theory went that William had been photographing military shipments near nearby Fort Bliss, and the KGB had extracted him. Even one of the local sheriffs eventually publicly endorsed a version of this. But hold on, does the KGB at the top of its game run a covert extraction of a compromised agent by leaving dirty dishes in the sink, leaving thousands of dollars in checks on the counter, leaving a Cadillac in a mechanic's garage that a random employee immediately notes is being driven by the wrong guy? That's not tradecraft. That is a crime scene. And when the FBI actually looked into the espionage angle, they found nothing. No file, no surveillance, no intelligence chatter. William Patterson was, as far as national security was concerned, a completely ordinary guy who happened to own a camera store. Theory 3. And this is the theory that just will not go away. The friends. Look at the arithmetic of what happened after the Pattersons vanished. A telegram appears. It puts William's store manager in charge of the business. A letter appears. It divides the couple's remaining assets among their employees. Their friend Cecil Ward, the mechanic, receives their Cadillac delivered by a stranger in the middle of the night and then waits 5 months before reporting them missing to police. 5 months. That is not the behavior of a worried friend. That is the behavior of somebody trying to run out a clock. A wealthy man does not liquidate his life and hand his empire to his employees on his way out the door. He hires lawyers. He wires money. He goes to Zurich. He does not send a Western Union telegram from an unknown location and hope his auditor plays along. The whole paperwork trail feels less like a couple starting over in Mexico and more like a highly amateurish 5-month attempt to make sure nobody looked too closely at what actually happened in that garage on the night of March 5th. And then there is the piece of this case that came out of nowhere and changed everything. In 1984, 27 years after the Pattersons vanished, a man named Rinaldo Nangare walked into a police station in El Paso, and finally told his story. In the days shortly after the Pattersons disappeared, Nongaray had been hired to clean the property at 3000 Piedmont Avenue. He was an undocumented immigrant, which is why, he explained, he had kept his mouth shut for nearly 3 decades. He was terrified of being deported. What he said he saw at the Patterson house is the coldest detail in this entire case. He said he found severe evidence of a violent struggle in the garage. He also said he found deeply disturbing physical evidence caught on the propeller of William's boat. And he said he watched one of William's known associates remove heavily stained bedsheets from the house and put them into the trunk of a car. That was the testimony. And then, before investigators could really lean on it, Nongaray died in a car accident in 1986. No cross-examination, no forensic follow-up, no opportunity to identify the associate, just a dead witness and a case that had gone cold 30 years ago. That's where it sits still. For decades after 1957, there were tantalizing reports of William and Margaret being spotted in Mexico, a resort here, a small town there, but nothing ever confirmed. No sighting ever produced a photograph, a fingerprint, a signature that could be verified. William, Margaret, and whatever really happened in that garage all slipped across the border together and evaporated into the Chihuahuan desert. What they left behind at 3000 Piedmont Avenue was, in every real sense, a ghost ship on land. The dishes still in the sink, the checks still on the counter, the Cadillac in the garage waiting to be picked up, Margaret's dresses still hanging in the closet, and Tommy, the cat that Margaret Patterson would have crawled through fire to protect, wandering room to room, waiting to be fed. They were living the perfect 1950s American dream. And in a single night, they walked out of it and left every single thing behind, except, somehow, the paperwork that made a few of their friends very rich. There's a specific kind of illusion that a modern cruise ship sells you. You walk on board a 10-story floating hotel, and everything inside is engineered to make you forget you are on the ocean at all. The bright buffets, the pool decks, the comedy clubs, the strings of white lights running down the promenade, thousands of people laughing, drinking, taking photos with the captain. It feels safer than a shopping mall. And then, sometimes at night, if you step out onto one of the outer decks and away from the noise, you look over the rail. And what you see is nothing. No horizon, no stars if the clouds are heavy, just black moving water hundreds of feet below you, running for miles in every direction. And a wind loud enough that if you screamed for help, it would eat the sound. That is the environment where, in May 2005, a Vietnamese-American couple in their 60s and 70s, celebrating almost half a century of marriage, simply ceased to exist on board a carnival ship called the Destiny. Their case would eventually reach the United States Congress. And 2 decades later, the cruise line has never given their family a real answer about what happened. Let me set the scene. The Carnival Destiny was, in 2005, one of the biggest ships in the Carnival fleet, a giant, nearly 1,000 feet long, multiple pools, a casino, show lounges, room for close to 3,000 passengers and roughly 1,000 crew. On this particular cruise, in mid-May of 2005, she was doing a 7-night Caribbean loop, turquoise water, palm trees, calypso music, warm nights. But here's the thing about a cruise ship that you don't feel until you're on one. During the day, in port, the ship is a party. At night, in open water between islands, most of the ship goes to sleep. The interior corridors get quiet. The show lounges close down. And the outer decks, the walking track on deck 3, the sun decks up top, they empty out. On a leg like Barbados to Aruba, you're doing an overnight sail across serious open Caribbean. That means once you leave the last island behind you, the ship is alone. No coastlines, no harbors, no other boats close enough to see, just you and a lot of dark water. Now the couple. Their names were Hugh Pham and Hugh Tran. He was 71 years old, she was 67, and their story before they ever boarded that ship is one of the most quietly heroic stories in this whole case. At the end of the Vietnam War, they had been part of the massive wave of refugees who fled the country by boat. Actually, they had spent 2 weeks adrift on a cramped, derelict container ship in the South China Sea. Barely any water, almost no food, not sure if any of them would live. They survived it, somehow. Both of them. They eventually made it to the United States, put roots down, built a life, raised children, and became beloved American grandparents. By 2005, they had been married for 49 years, which is why this particular cruise mattered. Their adult children had put it together as a gift, a joint celebration of their upcoming 49th anniversary and Mother's Day. The couple was traveling with their daughter and their granddaughter. It was supposed to be a family memory. According to their son Michael Pham, who would later spend 20 years fighting on their behalf, his parents were happy. They were healthy. They had no financial problems, no serious medical issues, no history of depression. They were actively planning a future, including a return trip to Vietnam to visit relatives. These were not people who got on that ship thinking about doing anything to themselves. That is who walked up the gangway of the Carnival Destiny in May of 2005. Two people who had survived a war and a starving voyage across an ocean, coming aboard a luxury ship to be spoiled by their children for a week. Now, this is where it gets strange. At some point on May 12th, while the ship was crossing open water between Barbados and Aruba, Hue Pham and Huey Tran disappeared. Their daughter and granddaughter, who were on the trip with them, hadn't seen them for a stretch and started to worry. They went to the cabin to check. The door, according to reports the family has fought to keep visible in coverage of this case, was locked from the outside. Ship security eventually opened it, and what they found on the inside is arguably the single most important detail in the entire case. The cabin was neat, perfectly in order, not tossed, not staged, just quiet. And every one of Hugh and Hugh's important possessions was still sitting inside. Their passports were there, their cash was there, their luggage was there, the clothes they'd folded for the next day were there, their eyeglasses were there, and critically, their daily medications were still there, untouched. Now, think about who these people were. An elderly couple in their late 60s and early 70s, with the routine health issues that come with that age, does not skip a daily dose of medication. Ever. Their pills were the first thing they took in the morning. If they had walked away from that cabin planning to come back, they would have taken the meds first. If they had walked away from that cabin planning not to return, they would have had zero reason to leave a full week's supply of prescription medication neatly boxed on a bathroom counter. The medications sitting undisturbed do not fit any narrative of intent. The ship went into search mode. Every deck, every corridor, every service area, nothing. The only physical trace anyone found, anywhere, was up on one of the outer decks. There, near a railing, sitting neatly, side by side, were the couple's flip-flops. 2 pairs, placed together, empty. That's all that was left. Carnival's answer, which came out fast and hardened over the following weeks, was that Hugh Pham and Hugh Tran had intentionally chosen to end their lives at sea. Tragic, but explainable, and, importantly for a cruise line's bottom line, nobody's legal fault. Let's stress test that. Theory 1. The voluntary departure. Sit with this for a second. This was a couple who had spent 2 weeks in a starving open boat in the South China Sea and refused to die, who then rebuilt their entire lives from zero on another continent, who then spent nearly 5 decades of marriage together, raising children, becoming grandparents, and building a peaceful life in the United States. And you are telling me that at ages 71 and 67, in the middle of a gift vacation their kids had arranged for them, they simultaneously decided the moment was right to intentionally enter the pitch-black Caribbean at night. Together, without a note, without a phone call to anybody, without a single conversation with a single family member, friend, doctor, or clergy person indicating that either of them was in that kind of pain. People who survive that much do not come apart on a cruise ship a week from their 49th anniversary. It runs against every measurable thing anyone knew about them. Theory 2. The locked door. Even if you somehow got past the biography and entertained the theory of a voluntary departure, How do you explain the cabin door being locked from the outside? You can't lock yourself out of your own cabin and then voluntarily go overboard. If the door was locked from the outside, someone else, someone with either a key card or key access, locked that door after Hugh and Hugh were no longer inside it. That is not a small detail. That is the anatomy of a staged scene. Theory 3. The flip-flops. Cruise line investigators, and honestly, a lot of maritime authorities across the industry, have historically treated shoes placed neatly by the rail as an almost automatic marker of a passenger voluntarily leaving the ship. Which, sure, that's a real pattern, but it is also the easiest possible thing to fake. If somebody wanted to make foul play look like an intentional act on a cruise ship, they would leave the shoes exactly like that, neatly, side by side, waiting to be found. And the family has always pointed out, correctly, I think, that shoes near a rail on a ship where everyone knows the shoes on deck assumption doesn't prove intent, it proves access to that pattern. Theory 4. And this is the piece that turned this from a family tragedy into a legal and political issue. The ship was in international waters when this happened, which means local police could not step on board and lock down a crime scene. The ship kept moving. By the time it docked in Aruba, an unknown number of hours had passed. The cabin had been walked through by staff. The deck where the flip-flops sat had been walked past by other passengers. Any physical evidence of foul play, trace fibers, a partial print on the rail, a fresh scuff, would have degraded or been contaminated. The FBI eventually gets involved with disappearances at sea on U.S.-flagged vessels or ones involving U.S. citizens, but it takes time to spin up. And by the time investigators actually got aboard, a potential killer, a passenger, a crew member, a stranger, could have simply walked off at the next port and vanished into the Caribbean. That is the horror at the center of this case. Not just that Hugh and Hugh vanished, but that the physical environment where they vanished was, at that moment, legally almost a lawless one. The ocean at night, on a foreign-flagged ship in international waters, is one of the few places on modern Earth where who's in charge gets a really uncomfortable answer. Their son Michael Pham, did not accept the voluntary departure theory. He never has. And he did something remarkable with his grief. He co-founded a nonprofit called International Cruise Victims, an organization dedicated to advocating for the families of people who have died, disappeared, or been assaulted at sea. He testified before the United States Congress. He pushed for federal legislation requiring cruise lines to report crimes on their ships to the FBI. He fought, publicly, patiently for years, to make the black hole that swallowed his parents just a little bit smaller for the next family. And to a real extent, he succeeded. In the years after Hugh Pham and Hugh Tran vanished, U.S. federal law began to require cruise lines to report serious incidents. Ship railings got new regulations. The reporting of overboard events tightened. The congressional hearings his advocacy triggered directly shaped how cruise industry accountability now works in this country. But none of it brought back the two people this case was actually about. That's where we leave it. An elderly Vietnamese-American couple who had survived 2 weeks of open ocean once already and lived to build a beautiful American life on the other side of it, boarded a carnival ship as a family gift to celebrate the woman they loved and the marriage they had spent nearly half a century inside. Somewhere between Barbados and Aruba, on a dark stretch of open Caribbean, in a cabin that was later found locked from the outside, they left behind their passports, their cash, and their morning pills, and 2 pairs of flip-flops placed carefully side by side on an empty deck were the only signature of them the ship gave back. Everything else, the answer, the accountability, the story of what actually happened in those minutes, the ocean took with it. On a Saturday morning in May of 1971, 3 young children woke up in a small trailer in Corbin, Kentucky, and slowly began to realize that no one else was home. Their parents' bed was empty. The kitchen was empty. The driveway was empty. The family's big white 1967 Ford Galaxy was gone. On the counter, undisturbed, sat a fresh, uncashed paycheck. On the bed, undisturbed, sat their mother's purse, the one she took everywhere. And in the kitchen, sitting in its usual spot, was the small jar where Claude Shelton kept the family's hidden emergency savings, about $600 in cash. Except the jar was empty. Somebody had taken the money and left everything else behind. That is where this case starts. Not with a scream, not with a struggle, not with a mysterious phone call, just with 3 little kids in a trailer full of unanswered questions that, more than 50 years later, no one has ever been able to close. Let me set the scene. Corbin, Kentucky, late May 1971. This is deep eastern Kentucky, right up against the Appalachian foothills. Working-class country, coal country, trucking country, small towns, tight-knit families, front porches with the lights on until late, and neighbors who know each other by the sound of their trucks pulling in. The Sheltons lived in a place called Jerry's Trailer Park, over on 18th Street, a modest, quiet, blue-collar community where nobody had much, but everybody had each other's back. But here's the part of Corbin that matters for this case. The second you get out of the trailer park or out of the town proper, you're immediately on winding, unlit country roads. 2-lane blacktop cutting through thick Appalachian woods, past deep hollers, past rushing creeks, past drop-offs and ravines that even locals treated with respect. Nighttime out on those roads is a specific kind of dark, not city dark, not suburb dark, Kentucky dark. No streetlights, no shoulder lights, nothing but your headlights carving a tunnel through the trees, and beyond that tunnel, black woods and black water in every direction. If you wanted to make a car vanish in 1971 Corbin, the geography was ready to help you. Now, the people. Claude Taylor Shelton, 36 years old, was the anchor of his family. He was a United States Navy veteran. 10 straight years of steady employment at a local factory. And if you know Appalachia in that era, you know how much that streak means. 10 years of showing up, 10 years of clocking in, 10 years of bringing a paycheck home to his wife. Martha Sue Shelton, his wife, was 27. Almost a decade younger than Claude. She was warm, she was involved with her kids, and she was, by every account anyone has ever offered up, a devoted mother. Not goes through the motions devoted. Devoted, devoted. Together, Claude and Martha had 3 young children, and that is really the whole context you need to understand this case. Their lives were not glamorous, they were not wealthy, but by every measurable metric, they were stable. Claude wasn't a drinker, he wasn't a gambler. There's no documented history of domestic abuse, no evidence of drug use, no criminal record, no known enemies. The Sheltons were, in every visible way, an ordinary devoted couple whose whole world revolved around 3 kids in a trailer. Which is what makes what happened on Friday, May 21st, 1971, so hard to make sense of. Because in the days leading up to that Friday night, according to reports that surfaced later, Claude had been acting strangely. Nervous, jumpy, looking over his shoulder, not the demeanor of a man who was about to punch out on a normal weekend. Something was on his mind. Something was scaring him, and he wasn't telling anybody what. That Friday, the family did what a Kentucky family in May does. They drove out to nearby Williamsburg to visit the kids' grandparents. Normal afternoon, normal dinner, normal drive home to the trailer park. Once they were back, Claude and Martha ran the kids through the usual bedtime routine. Teeth, pajamas, story time, tuck in. Sometime later, when Claude and Martha's 11-year-old daughter Sheila was drifting off to sleep, she overheard a hushed conversation between her parents. Not an argument, not loud, just quiet. And what she heard was Claude asking Martha a single weirdly specific question. Are you going with me, or are you going to stay here? The context of the conversation, as Sheila later remembered it, was that Claude was planning a quick trip out to King's Truck Stop, a local 24-hour place about 5 miles down the road. Martha decided to go with him. At some point after the children were asleep, Claude and Martha walked out of the trailer, got into their big white 1967 Ford Galaxie 500 with the Kentucky plate 937-944 and drove off into that famous Kentucky dark. Neither of them was ever seen again, neither was the Galaxie. The next morning, the kids woke up in an empty trailer. Police were called, and when investigators started walking through that trailer, they found something that has confounded everyone who has ever worked this case since. The scene inside was contradictory, deeply contradictory. On one hand, this looked like a couple in a hurry, because the small jar in the kitchen where Claude kept the family's hidden emergency cash, the entire $600 he had scraped together, was empty, cleaned out, every dollar. In 1971, $600 for a working-class Kentucky family wasn't pocket money. That was multiple months of rent. That was every ounce of financial security they had. And whoever left the trailer that night had specifically stopped, opened that jar, and taken it. On the other hand, this did not look like a couple planning to disappear, because Martha's purse was still sitting inside the trailer, her purse, with her ID inside it, with presumably whatever loose money she kept in her wallet. And sitting on the kitchen counter, in plain sight, was a fresh uncashed paycheck of Claude's. Think about that combination for a second. If you are running away, you take the ID. You take the paycheck, that's more money, and it's already in your name. You take everything you can. If you are not running away, you don't clean out the jar. So what happened here? Somebody hurried to grab hidden cash but somehow ignored money and identification that were sitting out in the open? That doesn't fit either theory. And nothing else was gone. No suitcases, no extra clothes, no family photos, no favorite mementos. The trailer looked, in every other respect, like a family that had planned to be home the next morning. Police canvassed King's truck stop, the stated destination. Every overnight employee working that shift, the folks who would have absolutely noticed a couple pulling up in a big white Galaxy at that hour, had no memory of Claude, Martha, or the car ever arriving. Which means one of two things. Either they never made it to the truck stop, or they never intended to go there in the first place, and King's was just the story they had ready in case somebody asked. All right, let's take the theories apart. Theory 1, the runaway. They took the $600 and started a new life. Fine. But hold on. What kind of mother tucks her 3 small children into bed, kisses them goodnight, tells them she loves them, and then walks out the front door knowing they will wake up in an empty trailer and never see her again? That is not a small psychological ask. That is asking us to believe that Martha Sue Shelton, who by every account adored those kids, executed the coldest possible act of parental abandonment on the same night she read them a bedtime story. And she did it without so much as packing a change of clothes, without her purse, without her ID on $600 and nothing else. It doesn't fit her. It doesn't fit anyone who knew her. And the uncashed paycheck sitting on the counter is the tell. You don't leave money behind when you're running. Theory 2, the accident. Maybe they really did head out into the Kentucky night. Maybe they got turned around on one of those unlit 2-lane roads. Maybe the Galaxy went off the shoulder into a ravine or a river and disappeared. It's possible. It's a big country car on a bad rural road in the dark. But the problem is the same problem every disappearance case with a missing vehicle has. Since 1971, that car, a full-sized 1967 Ford Galaxy 500, a very distinctive American sedan, has been searched for by everyone from local Kentucky police to modern civilian sonar teams. Groups like Adventures with Purpose, which specialize in finding submerged vehicles, have swept through the local waterways near the Corbin area. Nothing. No car, no debris, no plate, not so much as a bumper. That's not impossible for an accident, but it is very hard to reconcile with the geography. Theory 3. The one the nervous looking over his shoulder reports keep pointing at. Foul play, debt, trouble. Whatever it was that had Claude jumpy in the days leading up to that Friday, maybe it caught up with him that night. Maybe the $600 was pulled out of the jar as a payoff, because that's exactly the amount of cash you grab in a hurry when someone gives you a deadline. That would explain a lot. Why he took the $600 but didn't touch the paycheck, no time. Why he asked Martha, "Are you going with me or are you going to stay here?" He knew this wasn't a normal errand. Why he was headed out to a truck stop late at night, a public neutral meeting spot. And why the truck stop staff never saw them arrive. They were intercepted before they got there. But even the foul play theory has a hole in the middle. If Claude went to meet a dangerous person, to pay off a debt, to hand over money, to get out of some kind of jam, why did he bring Martha along? You do not take your wife with you to a meeting you're nervous about, unless he thought she was safer with him than alone in the trailer that night, which is, in its own quiet way, an even scarier interpretation. And there is one more strange fragment worth mentioning. About 2 months after the Sheltons vanished, the body of a still unidentified woman turned up all the way across the country in Oregon. She matched Martha's general physical description. Decades later, in 2009, DNA tests were attempted to see if the Oregon Jane Doe might be Martha Sue Shelton. The results came back inconclusive, murky enough that the door still isn't fully closed on that lead, which means there is a possibility, however slim, that Martha's story didn't end in a Kentucky ravine. It may have kept going, cross-country, for weeks. But we don't know. We may never know. That is where this case sits, more than 50 years on. Sheila and her 2 younger siblings, the 3 little kids who woke up in that empty trailer, grew up not knowing whether their parents ran away from them, whether they crashed into some dark Kentucky water in the middle of the night, or whether they met with foul play. The scene was cleaned up and hid a full-size white Ford Galaxy so well that not a single bolt of it has ever surfaced. 3 children raised in the shadow of not knowing. Claude and Martha Shelton put their kids to bed on the night of May 21st, 1971. They took $600 out of a kitchen jar. They left a paycheck on the counter. They left a purse on the bed. They got in a car that everybody on their block would have recognized, and they drove off into the pitch-black Kentucky night. Somewhere between their front door and King's truck stop, 5 miles down the road, something happened that this world doesn't have an answer for. And a family that had almost nothing but each other, a Navy veteran, a devoted mother, 3 little kids in a trailer park, got quietly, permanently cut in half. There's a small, murky retention pond behind a highway motel in Brunswick, Georgia. If you drove past it, you would not think anything of it. It is one of thousands of unremarkable ponds engineered along Interstate 95 to catch runoff and keep the highway from flooding. Cattails on the edge, brown, opaque water, nothing dramatic. But that specific little pond, sitting quietly just off the frontage road behind a Holiday Inn, held a very, very heavy secret for 44 years. This is the case of Charles and Catherine Romer, a wealthy retired couple, a brand new luxury Lincoln, and one of the strangest disappearances on the Georgia coast. It's a case that had police helicopters, psychics, professional dive teams, and cold case investigators tearing apart every waterway in the American Southeast for 4 decades. And the entire time, the answer was sitting a few hundred feet from where they last slept. Let me set the scene. April 1980, Brunswick, Georgia. If you have ever driven the length of the East Coast on Interstate 95, you have passed through Brunswick without really noticing it. It's one of those classic highway waystation towns. A stretch of frontage road, a Waffle House, a couple of gas stations, a Holiday Inn, a Days Inn, a chain diner or 2. The kind of place designed to give you 6 hours of sleep and a plate of eggs before you get back in the car and keep going. But right around Brunswick, if you step off the highway for even a minute, the landscape changes fast. This is coastal Georgia, deep south marsh country. Past the parking lots, the ground turns into cypress and pine and thick, tangled underbrush. Waterways snake in every direction. There are deep tidal creeks, dark cypress swamps, and, most importantly for our story, man-made retention ponds carved out next to the highway to manage stormwater. During the day, in the sun, it's picturesque. But once the light goes down out there, the frontage roads become tunnels of shadow, the water at the edge of the pavement becomes invisible, and a person unfamiliar with the geography can very easily get turned around. Now let's talk about our couple. Charles Romer, 73, Catherine Romer, 75, both from Scarsdale, New York, one of the wealthiest suburbs in the country. Charles was a retired oil executive, not did well in oil retired, actually rich. Estate valued at over $1 million, which in 1980 dollars is a serious fortune. They were both on their second marriages. They had each been widowed once, and they were living the kind of comfortable, well-oiled late-life romance where you split your time between a nice place up north and a nicer place down south. Every winter, the roamers did what East Coast retirees have been doing for a century. They migrated south to Miami Beach for the cold months. Every spring, when the weather in New York finally turned civil, they drove back up. They were snowbirds, regimented, predictable. They traveled in style, in a big, brand-new, dark-colored 1979 Lincoln Continental. And critically, Catherine traveled with her personal jewelry collection, which the family later estimated was worth somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. In 1980 money. Now, hold that jewelry number in your head, because it's going to matter later. It's going to bend the entire course of this investigation for the next 44 years. On Easter Sunday, April 6, 1980, the roamers called one of their sons from their hotel in Miami Beach. Everything was normal. They were finishing up the trip and getting ready to start the long drive north. Standard check-in call. They got on the road. They drove for 2 days. Late in the afternoon on April 8th, they pulled off a 95 in Brunswick, Georgia, and checked into the Holiday Inn on New Jessup Highway. Room 149. The clerk saw them. They were tired. They were polite. They had money. They had big luggage. They went to the room. And here's where the details start to feel very, very specific. They actually settled in. This wasn't a 5-minute quick crash. They unpacked. Catherine took off her glasses. Charles spread out some paperwork, tax returns actually, which he apparently intended to look over that night. They set out drinking glasses next to a bottle of scotch. This is a couple that was preparing to relax, preparing to spend the evening in that specific room, in front of that specific TV, drinking that specific scotch. But before they settled in for the night, they needed to eat. So sometime after check-in, they got back in the Lincoln and drove out of the Holiday Inn parking lot to find dinner. Someone reported seeing the big, dark Lincoln Continental heading south on the highway a little later, near a cluster of local restaurants. That's the sighting. That is the last confirmed sighting of Charles and Catherine Romer. They never came back to room 149. Not that night, not the next morning. 3 full days later, on April 11th, a housekeeping attendant flagged management. The luggage was still in the room. The tax returns were still on the table. The scotch was still next to the glasses. The bed had not been slept in. Charles and Catherine were gone. The Lincoln was gone. Nothing had been touched. The Romer case turned into one of the biggest missing persons investigations in Georgia state history. And I want you to notice something important about how that investigation was built. Everyone, police, family, private investigators, anchored the entire theory of the case on that jewelry. Because when you have a wealthy elderly couple driving a luxury car, carrying 80 grand in diamonds and gold, the crime almost writes itself. Targeted highway robbery. Somebody watched them come off the interstate. Somebody followed them to the restaurant. Somebody ambushed them, took the jewels, and dumped the bodies far, far away. That was the theory that shaped the search. And that shape mattered. Search parties went into distant rivers. Blackwater dive teams, professional deepwater recovery divers, swept out dark stretches of coastal waterway looking for the Lincoln. Helicopters flew grids over the marshes. Family members hired psychics. Investigators followed leads deep into Florida, deep into inland Georgia, even up into other states. Every theory assumed the same central premise. The killers had taken the car far, far away for decades. Meanwhile, let's take those old theories apart the way we normally would, because for 44 years, this is exactly what everybody argued about. Theory 1. The runaway. Did the Romers just decide to keep driving? Get in the Lincoln, ditch the tax returns, and start a new adventure? Come on. Catherine left her glasses on the nightstand. Charles left his scotch out. They had paid for the room. They had unpacked. They were reading over financial paperwork. Nobody sets up a work and a drink evening in a Holiday Inn and then spontaneously disappears into the night. Also, they weren't the type. These were the most creatures of habit humans get. Theory 2. The swamp accident. Maybe they drove down a wrong frontage road, missed a curve, and ended up in one of those big Georgia swamps. Land yacht in the reeds, alligators, done. But hold on, a 1979 Lincoln Continental weighs about 2.5 tons and is nearly 20 feet long. If a car that size goes off the road into a Georgia wetland, it leaves a signature. Snapped saplings, crushed brush, tire ruts in the mud, something. And the initial searches did not find those signatures on any of the major nearby waterways. So the swamp accident theory got quietly pushed off to the side. Theory 3, the one that ate everything else, the targeted robbery. Wealthy couple, big diamonds, big car, perfect victims. This was the theory the family believed. This was the theory police leaned into. This was the theory that shaped where they searched, which, again, was far, far away from Brunswick. Because if a criminal is going to dump a body into a stolen luxury car, they're not going to do it 200 feet from the crime scene, right? That would be stupid, amateur, dangerous, right? Now here's where this case turns. Because for 44 years, nobody, not police, not family, not private investigators, not psychics, seriously searched the small, unremarkable little retention pond sitting quietly between the back of the Holiday Inn and the northbound lanes of Interstate 95. Why would they? The retention pond is right there. It's at the crime scene. It's 100 yards from room 149. The whole theory of the case said the answer had to be somewhere far away and hidden. The theory was wrong. On November 22, 2024, a Florida-based volunteer sonar and dive group called Sunshine State Sonar drove up to Brunswick, deployed their equipment, and pointed it at that retention pond. And within a very short time, they got a return. A big, distinctive, car-shaped return. They pulled up a 1979 Lincoln Continental. The car was so badly deteriorated after 44 years underwater that a tow truck actually snapped its equipment attempting to lift it out. It came up in pieces. When investigators drained the pond and started sorting through what they found, they discovered human remains inside the wreckage, and they recovered personal effects, including a belt engraved with the initials CRR, Charles R. Romer. The couple that had generated a nationwide search, the couple whose disappearance had generated 4 decades of theories about mob hits and highway robberies and shallow graves in the Georgia backcountry, had been sitting quietly the entire time in a stormwater pond, a football field away from their motel bed. Which lands us on the actual answer, or at least the answer we can reasonably reconstruct now. Charles and Catherine Ramey left their room to grab an early dinner. It was late in the day. Charles was 73, tired from 2 days of driving and driving a car he'd been living out of for the length of the eastern seaboard. Catherine had already taken her glasses off inside the room and, in the rush to grab a bite, had not put them back on. She was traveling without correction. He was driving an unfamiliar frontage road in a town he had never been to before, at that specific gray hour when the daylight is starting to go, but the streetlights haven't fully come on yet. Investigators believe the car went into the water in reverse, which is not the signature of a swamp crash off a highway. It's the signature of a driver who was trying to back out of a parking space or turn around on the frontage road, misjudged where the ground ended, and rolled the Lincoln backwards into the retention pond behind him. In the failing light from behind the wheel, that stretch of murky water probably looked just like the asphalt around it. The car dropped into the pond, filled with water fast, and settled to the bottom. It was heavy enough, and the pond was quiet enough that within a day or two the surface had gone perfectly still again. There was no oil slick that anyone noticed. There was no news of a splash. And critically, the theory that the case was a targeted crime meant that nobody for 44 years took a serious look at the water 20 seconds walk from the motel, the $80,000 in diamonds, the detail that gave this case its whole shape, had actually pulled the entire investigation away from the truth. That's the ending, or the closest thing this case has to one. The Romers were finally identified. Their family, who had spent nearly half a century wondering, finally had an answer. The Holiday Inn is called the Royal Inn now, but room 149 is still there. Interstate 95 is still there. The little retention pond, drained and searched and empty now, is still there. They were tired. They wanted dinner. They backed the Lincoln up in the wrong direction on the wrong strip of asphalt at the wrong moment of an April evening, and the earth, or rather, a very ordinary man-made drainage pond, swallowed them whole. It didn't take a hitman. It didn't take a swamp. It just took a single wrong-way turn on a frontage road and the arrogant assumption held for 4 decades that the answer had to be somewhere far away. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the answer has been waiting patiently, all along, 100 yards behind the motel. In the spring of 1994, a guy with a backhoe was digging a swimming pool in the backyard of a house in San Marino, California. San Marino, if you don't know it, is one of those neighborhoods where a $50,000 landscaping job counts as light maintenance, manicured lawns, circular driveways, country club money on every block. The backhoe pushed maybe 3 or 4 feet into the dirt when it hit something that wasn't dirt. What the crew pulled out of that hole would rewrite one of the strangest disappearance cases in Los Angeles County history, and expose a con man so bold, so brazenly theatrical, that America wouldn't fully learn his name for another 20 years. This is the story of John and Linda Sohus, the couple who told their friends they'd been recruited for a top-secret government mission, and then, apparently, took a permanent detour into a hole in their own backyard. Let's set the scene properly, because the setting is what makes this case so deeply unsettling. San Marino, California, early 1985. If you've never been, imagine every rich suburb movie set you've ever pictured and then double the property values. This is old money Los Angeles. Ivy on the walls, rose bushes trimmed with kitchen shears, country clubs where the average membership fee is longer than most people's rent. The whole culture of San Marino runs on a very specific unspoken rule: you do not pry into your neighbor's business. If the eccentric guy next door claims to be a Rothschild or a Rockefeller or the ninth-in-line heir to some German duchy, you nod politely and hand him a cocktail. Wealth here is presumed. Pedigree is presumed. Poking around would be, frankly, tacky. That polite blindness, that's the camouflage the killer needed. At the center of our story is a house on Lorraine Road. It's one of those big San Marino properties, a substantial main house with a smaller detached guest cottage tucked out back. Inside the main house lived John Sohus, 27 years old, and his wife Linda, 29. Add to that John's mother, Ruth Dede Sohus, an older, wealthy widow with a taste for cocktails and a personality her neighbors would describe generously as difficult. John and Linda were what you'd call a soft, quirky, deeply nerdy couple. John was a computer programmer at a time when that phrase still made most adults squint. He loved science fiction. Linda loved science fiction too. She painted it. Fantasy landscapes, dragons, otherworldly stuff. She worked at a bookstore during the day and made her art at night. They weren't rich. They weren't glamorous. They were living with John's mom because of an economic slump, which is a polite way of saying they couldn't afford to move out. And by early 1985, things were finally starting to look up. They'd just bought a new pickup truck. Linda was starting to sell her art. Life was inching forward. And then there was the man in the guest house. His name, the name he was giving out anyway, was Christopher Chichester. He was in his mid-20s, spoke with a plummy accent that drifted between vaguely British and vaguely European. And he told anyone who would listen that he was a descendant of British royalty. Ancient title, money and trust, studying in America for the culture. He was, by all accounts, charming, funny, always the most interesting guy at the dinner party. But there was something off, something both John and Linda picked up on. They flat out told friends that Chichester was creepy. They avoided him. They kept the door between the main house and the yard locked. Their instincts, as it turned out, were completely correct. Now, here's where the story tips over into the surreal. In late January and early February of 1985, John and Linda started telling their close circle something very strange, something new. They were about to disappear for a while, they said, because they had been recruited for a highly classified government mission, top secret, very hush-hush. They couldn't say more. Linda told an art client that they'd be gone for months. To one friend, the destination was New York. To another, it was Connecticut. To a third, it was some kind of computer job for the feds. On February 8th, 1985, Linda dropped by her mother's house. She said she and John were leaving for a 2-week trip. She asked her mom if she could park their new pickup truck at her mother's place while they were gone. Her mother said no. Linda drove away. That's the last time anyone in her family saw her alive. For the next several weeks, life on Lorraine Road just continued. But John didn't come to work. Linda didn't open the bookstore, and she was famously reliable about opening the bookstore. Didi Sohus began drinking heavily and telling neighbors in a fog that the kids had moved to France. And then the postcards started arriving. They were mailed from Paris. The handwriting kind of looked like Linda's and kind of didn't. They were breezy, generic, the vacation postcard equivalent of having a wonderful time, wish you were here. One of them arrived at Linda's mother's house, another surfaced elsewhere. And this is where the story gets very, very strange, because Linda Sohus did not have a passport. Linda Sohus barely had a couple $100s to her name. Linda Sohus had never mentioned Paris to anyone, and John and Linda had allegedly gone to New York or Connecticut for a top-secret government job. So how exactly do you end up sending postcards from France? Meanwhile, back in San Marino, the tenant in the guest house was suddenly driving John's truck around town. When neighbors asked, Christopher Chichester had a smooth, ready answer. Oh, John sold it to him before he left for the mission. Nice guy, John. Cash deal, all above board. And then, a few months later, with John's truck and John's belongings and a whole lot of new questions circling, Chichester himself packed up and vanished from San Marino. Just gone. Off to the next town. Off to the next identity. Now, hold on. Because right around this same window, other bizarre little details were quietly stacking up. Chichester had tried to sell a heavy oriental rug to a woman he knew from a local church. She noticed it was heavily stained with what looked like biological evidence. He waved it off. Wine spill. Old rug. She passed. Around the same time, Chichester had also borrowed heavy power tools from a local judge, for reasons he never really explained. Stained rug, heavy equipment, missing couple, and a tenant driving the missing man's pickup truck. If this were happening in a trailer park in the middle of nowhere, red flags would have gone up in a week. But this was San Marino. Rich people, polite society. Nobody wanted to be the neighbor who called the police on the eccentric aristocrat next door. So, the years passed. Didi Sohus died in the late 1980s, taking whatever she did or didn't know with her. The house on Lorraine Road eventually sold. New owners moved in. And in 1994, 9 years after John and Linda vanished into thin air, those new owners decided the backyard would look really nice with a pool. The backhoe went to work. And under 3 or 4 feet of dirt, wrapped in fiberglass bags, wrapped in plastic, wrapped in more plastic, investigators found the tragic remains of John Sohus. And here's the detail I still can't shake. The remains had been intentionally concealed, with a portion of them hidden inside a collegiate book bag. A book bag stamped with the logo of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Nobody in John Sohus' life had ever attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Nobody at all. Except, as investigators would eventually learn, a certain Christopher Chichester, whose real name was Christian Gerhardsreiter, a German-born grifter who had briefly enrolled at that exact university in the early 1980s before drifting west to California and inventing himself a new name and a new bloodline. Okay, let's take a breath and pull the story apart, because the official narrative that got planted in 1985 was designed to keep people from asking questions. And once you actually ask the questions, the whole thing shatters. Start with the spy story. Really think about it for a second. John Sohus was a mild-mannered civilian computer nerd. Linda was a bookstore clerk who painted dragons. What government agency in 1985 is recruiting that specific pair of humans for a covert operation? The CIA? The NSA? None of it makes sense. The top secret mission story sounds like a spy movie plotted by somebody who had watched a lot of spy movies. Because that is, almost certainly, exactly what it was. Somebody, and there's really only one candidate here, sat that trusting young couple down and fed them a fantasy exciting enough to make them willingly pack their bags, tell their friends a story, and cut off contact with everyone who cared about them. It was a script, and they walked right into it. Then there's the France postcards. The postcards arrived after John was, we now know, already deceased and concealed in the backyard. So who wrote them? Option 1, Linda was still alive in Europe, mailing them herself. But she had no passport, no money, and no reason to abandon her cats and her whole life. Option 2, the killer forged them, using letters he had access to as their live-in tenant and had a contact mail them from Paris to buy time. That option looks a lot more likely. And a killer smart enough to do that is also smart enough not to leave a second body in the same yard. Wherever Linda is, she is very far from Lorraine Road. Now let's talk about Dee Dee, John's mother, because this is the piece that quietly makes me the most uncomfortable. Her son and her daughter-in-law vanish. A strange young man in her guest house is suddenly driving her son's pickup truck. Stained rug rumors are floating around the neighborhood, and Dee Dee Sohus never calls the police, never files a missing persons report. She just keeps drinking, tells neighbors the kids moved to France, and goes to her grave. Was she manipulated by a charming con man who fed her the spy story too? Was she in denial? Or did she know something she couldn't bring herself to say out loud? We will never know. And then, finally, there's the real identity of the man in the guest house. Christopher Chichester was one of at least a dozen aliases used by Christian Gerhardsreiter, a German immigrant who spent the next 20 years bouncing across the United States, inventing new names, marrying wealthy women under false pretenses, and eventually pretending to be a Rockefeller, the Clark Rockefeller, who became national news in 2008 after kidnapping his own daughter during a custody dispute. Once investigators had him in custody, they started peeling the layers back, and every layer led further west and further back in time. Back to San Marino, back to a stained rug, back to a borrowed heavy power tools, back to a Wisconsin book bag with a skull inside. In 2013, 28 years after John Sohus vanished, Christian Gerhardsreiter was convicted of a first-degree felony. But the case only got half an ending, because the state got its man. The state got its conviction, and in some meaningful sense, John Sohus got justice. But Linda Sohus, Linda who painted dragons, Linda who worked at the bookstore, Linda who supposedly sent breezy postcards from a Paris she almost certainly never saw. Linda has never been found. Not a bone, not a bag, not a single confirmed trace. Gerhardsreiter's defense team, at trial, tried to float the theory that Linda had actually been the one responsible for John's fate and then fled to Europe. The prosecution shredded it. She had no motive, she had no money, she had no passport. She left her cats behind, and if you knew Linda, you knew she would never in 1,000 years leave her cats behind. She was almost certainly a second victim. But where? Where did he put her? Was she killed the same night as John and buried somewhere else? Was she taken alive and disposed of later? Was there ever a plan, or was she simply a loose end? We don't know. We may never know. Gerhardsreiter isn't talking, and it's been 40 years. Somewhere in California, or somewhere in the vast blank space between California and the next identity he stole, Linda Sohus is still missing. A young artist, a bookstore clerk, a woman who trusted the wrong tenant in the wrong guest house on the wrong quiet street, and a killer who slipped so neatly into her life that he was driving her husband's truck around town in broad daylight in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in America, while John was already buried under the roses out back. There's a specific kind of horror to the open ocean that people who live on land never really understand. On land, if something goes wrong, somebody hears you scream, somebody drives by, somebody eventually finds the body. But 40 miles off the coast of California, over water that plunges nearly 4,000 feet straight down into black nothing, the rules are different. Out there, the ocean is a vault, and in November of 2004, 3 men used that vault to make a retired probation officer and his wife disappear so completely that 20 years later, not a single bone of them has ever been recovered. This is the story of Thomas and Jackie Hawks, and it might be the most calculated, cold-blooded piece of maritime piracy ever committed on the California coast. Let's set the scene, because the setting is the trap. Newport Beach, California, November 2004. If you've never been, picture the postcard. Palm trees, sun, a harbor packed with white-hulled yachts bobbing gently against their moorings, golden retrievers on the docks, guys in board shorts drinking coffee at 7 in the morning. This is one of the wealthiest coastal communities in the country, and the boating culture there in 2004 was a very specific thing. It was a village. Everybody kind of knew everybody. Sailors trusted sailors. If you tied up next to a family for a week, you'd be swapping stories and cold beers by day 3. There was this baseline of camaraderie, this assumption that anyone with the money to keep a boat in Newport was, basically decent people. That trust is the thing that gets exploited here. Keep it in mind. Living right in the middle of that world, on a beautiful 55-foot Lan Hua trawler called the Well-Deserved, were Tom and Jackie Hawks. Tom was 57. He was a big guy, a physically imposing guy. Lifelong surfer, still in fighting shape, the kind of body language that made people step aside on a narrow dock. And he wasn't just physically formidable, he was a retired Yavapai County probation officer. Think about what that job does to a person. 20 years of being lied to. 20 years of watching parolees try to smile their way through a piss test. Tom Hawks had what everybody who ever met him called a laser-accurate BS detector. He could read a person in about 30 seconds. Jackie was 47, warm, kind, a big smiler. But don't mistake warm for soft. Back in 1985, Jackie had been in a catastrophic motorcycle crash. Her first husband died in it. She was left in a wheelchair for a stretch of her recovery. She fought her way back, walking, working, sailing the Pacific, living on a boat, all of it earned through a level of physical and mental grit most of us can't imagine. For years, Tom and Jackie had been living the dream, just the two of them and the Well-Deserved, sailing up and down the Pacific coast, cruising the Sea of Cortez, waking up in a different harbor every month, sun-soaked, salt in the hair, magazine cover retirement stuff. But something had shifted for them in 2004. Their family had a new baby. Tom and Jackie had just become grandparents, and that changed everything. Suddenly, the endless horizon didn't matter as much as being able to hold a newborn grandson in Arizona. They decided to sell the boat. They put the Well-Deserved on the market for $435,000, and they made a plan. Sell the yacht, buy a house, be near the grandbaby. That's the mindset. Two grandparents actively unwinding their entire lifestyle so they could go coo at a baby. Remember that. It matters. The listing brought in a buyer almost immediately. And here's where the story turns into a nightmare. His name was Skylar DeLeon. He was 25 years old. He was a former child actor. You might have seen his little cameo on the Power Rangers back in the 90s. Skinny guy, baby face. And if you dug even 1 inch beneath the surface, he was drowning, deep in debt. Prior burglary conviction, zero legitimate way to come up with the kind of money it takes to buy a $500,000 yacht. But Skylar walked onto the dock claiming he had the cash, not financing. Cash. He showed up with an associate to look at the boat, and this is the first moment the story almost saved the Hawks, because Tom's BS detector lit up like a Christmas tree. He looked at these two young, scruffy guys claiming to have $500,000 in cash, and every alarm bell in his ex-probation officer brain started ringing. He didn't want to do the deal. He was ready to walk. And this is the part that's genuinely evil. Skylar came back a second time, but this time he brought his pregnant wife, Jennifer, and their 9-month-old baby. Think about the psychology of that. Tom and Jackie were literally in the process of selling their boat to be near their grandchild. And now, here comes this young couple with a pregnant belly and a baby in a car seat, cooing at the yacht. The suspicion melted. The wall came down. The Hawkses saw a young family, saw themselves, and let their guard drop. The pregnant wife was bait. That was the plan. On November 15, 2004, Tom and Jackie agreed to take the boat out on what boaters call a sea trial, a test run. You take the buyer out on the water, they see how she handles, you shake hands, you sign papers, standard stuff. But Skylar didn't come alone. He brought his associate, Alonzo McChain, and he brought a third guy named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Not the president, this was a former gang member, Muscle. That's the crew that pulled away from the Newport dock that morning. Tom, Jackie, a skinny former child actor, a quiet second guy, and a hardened ex-gangster. 40 miles offshore, over the Catalina Channel, in water almost 3,800 feet deep, the ambush went down. The yacht came back to Newport Harbor a few hours later. It tied up neatly in its slip, perfectly clean, perfectly quiet. And Tom and Jackie Hawks were not on it. At first, nothing looked wrong. The well-deserved was just back in her spot. But when Tom and Jackie's family couldn't reach them for a day, and then 2 days, panic set in. And that's when Skylar DeLeon calmly walked in with his story. He told police the transaction was done. He had bought the boat, in cash, and here, look, he had the paperwork, a perfectly notarized bill of sale, power of attorney, all signed by Tom and Jackie Hawks themselves. According to Skylar, the Hawkses were so excited to have all that cash in hand that they'd hopped in their silver Honda CR-V and driven straight down to Mexico for an early spontaneous retirement. He said they'd be in touch. And the Honda CR-V? A few days later, it did in fact turn up in Mexico, just like Skylar said it would. Case closed, right? Rich retirees decided to run off to Baja. Weird, but people do weird things. Except, no, not so fast. Because when you actually sit with Skylar's story for even 5 seconds, it starts falling apart in your hands. Let's start with the Mexico thing. Tom and Jackie were selling the boat specifically to move closer to their newborn grandson. That was the entire point. That was the whole reason they were on the market. And you're telling me the second they got the money, they blew right past their grandbaby's crib and disappeared into Mexico without a phone call? Without a wave goodbye to their kids? These were not distant, cold people. These were the kind of grandparents who buy little baby-sized sailor hats. There is no version of Tom and Jackie Hawks that walks away from that child. It doesn't exist. It never existed. Now, let's talk about the cash. Skylar's story was that he handed Tom Hawks a duffel bag stuffed with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash out on the open ocean in exchange for a $435,000 yacht. Hold on a second. Tom Hawks was a retired probation officer. This is a man whose entire professional life was built around not being fooled. A guy like that does not do a $500,000 all-cash boat deal in the middle of the Pacific. He does escrow. He does a title company. He does a certified check with the bank on speed dial. The idea that a cautious, street-smart, career law enforcement guy would sail 40 miles offshore with 3 strangers and a bag of cash and just, take their word for it, that is not who Tom Hawks was. It never happened. And then there's the physical piece. Tom Hawks was 57, yes, but he was a big, athletic, surf-strong human being. Skylar DeLeon was a scrawny kid. There is no universe in which Skylar DeLeon overpowers Tom Hawks in a physical fight. Not one-on-one, not two-on-one. You'd need serious muscle, and you'd need the element of surprise, and you'd probably need weapons. The lie only holds together if Tom just went quietly. And Tom didn't do anything quietly. But here's the detail that actually blew the case wide open. Within days of the sale, someone started trying to drain Tom and Jackie's bank accounts in California using those freshly notarized power of attorney documents. Think about that. If Tom and Jackie were retired in Mexico, they'd need their own money. Nobody needs a power of attorney over their own accounts to buy tacos in Cabo. The second Skylar started reaching into their finances, the whole cover story collapsed. Investigators pulled the thread. The FBI came in. Pressure went on the accomplices. And Alonzo McChain broke. What Alonzo told them is the reason I'm telling you this story instead of a happier one. 40 miles out at sea, once the well-deserved was safely beyond the sight of any other vessel, the 3 men made their move. Tom fought. Of course he fought. He was Tom Hawks. He was struck in the temple hard enough to stun him. They restrained Tom and Jackie. They forced them both at gunpoint to sign the sale documents and the power of attorney that would let Skylar clean out their accounts. Then they were bound to the yacht's anchor and forced overboard, tragically losing their lives to the depths of the ocean. Down through the sunlight, down through the cold, down for thousands of feet into the dark, freezing, and pressurized depths of the Pacific. And that's where they stayed. That's where they still are. Back on the deck, The killers pulled out industrial bleach and started cleaning. They wiped down the yacht until it looked pristine. They drove her back to Newport. They tied her up in her slip like nothing had happened. They planted the Honda in Mexico, and then they walked into a police station with a smile and a stack of paperwork and thought they had gotten away with it. They hadn't. Skylar DeLeon, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Jennifer DeLeon were all eventually convicted for their roles in the murders. Skylar and Kennedy received the death penalty. Jennifer, the woman who had used her own pregnant belly and her own infant as camouflage to get past Tom Hawks's BS detector, was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. The state got its answers. The story got a courtroom ending. But the ocean didn't give anything back. Because for all the confessions, all the testimony, all the guilty verdicts, the bodies of Tom and Jackie Hawks were never recovered. They were never going to be. Nearly 3,800 feet of Black Pacific water is not a place you send divers. The couple who had spent years falling in love with the sea are now, in a way, part of it forever. Handcuffed to an anchor, wrapped in cold and pressure and silence. They were selling their yacht so they could hold their grandson. They never made it home. And the well-deserved, the boat named for a retirement they had earned twice over, is the last thing that ever saw them alive. Imagine surfacing after a normal 40-minute dive on the Great Barrier Reef. You break the surface, you pull your regulator out of your mouth, you push your mask up on your forehead, and you turn to look for the boat that dropped you here. The boat that has your passport and your clothes and your money and your entire ride back to shore. And it is not there. You spin around, 360 degrees, no boat, no island, no coastline, no airplane, nothing but blue water in every direction, an empty horizon, and the slow, sickening understanding that you are 40 miles off the coast of Australia in shark water, and nobody on Earth is currently aware that you have been left behind. That is the exact moment Tom and Eileen Lonergan lived through on January 25th, 1998. And this story is more horrifying than fiction because their disappearance was so casually, so bureaucratically negligent that the crew who left them out there didn't notice they were gone for 2 entire days. Let me set the stage properly, because this is one of those cases where the setting is doing 90% of the horror. Port Douglas, Queensland, Australia. January 1998. This is peak Southern Hemisphere summer. Blue skies, glassy water, a tropical breeze off the Coral Sea. Port Douglas is one of the main gateway towns for tourists who want to see the Great Barrier Reef. And in the late 90s, it was a big, booming, sunburned, backpacker and diver kind of place. There's this whole culture built around it. You wake up, you get on a boat, you cruise out for an hour or two, you slip into water that is stupidly clear, you spend a morning drifting around coral in a national wonder, and you're back at the pub by 5 for a cold beer. That's the pitch, that's the postcard. But here's the thing you don't fully feel until you're actually on the water. The Great Barrier Reef is enormous. It runs for over 1,400 miles. And when you get 30, 40 miles offshore, out to the outer sections like St. Crispin's Reef, you can't see land anymore. You cannot see the mainland. You cannot see an island. You cannot see another boat once yours leaves. Underwater, it's a paradise. Coral gardens, sea turtles, reef sharks, the whole Finding Nemo dream. But the moment you surface, alone, the whole thing flips. The paradise becomes a void. The blue becomes an infinite rolling swell that hides your head every 3 or 4 seconds. The sun that was warming you turns into a hammer, and underneath your kicking feet, thousands of feet down sometimes, the reef drops off into serious open ocean. Tiger Shark Ocean. That's the theater this case plays out in. Beautiful and lethal, in that order. Our couple is Tom Lonergan, 33, and his wife Eileen, 28. Both from Louisiana, both graduates of LSU. And critically, these are not Instagram tourists on a bucket list dive. Tom and Eileen were serious people. They were dedicated humanitarians who had just spent 2 grueling years in the Peace Corps, living and working on the remote South Pacific island nation of Tuvalu. They were between assignments. They'd wrapped Tuvalu, they were traveling for a bit, and they were preparing to head to Fiji next for their second Peace Corps tour. And they were experienced, certified scuba divers. This is the piece that matters most going in. They had been diving for years. They understood the ocean. They understood the risks. They understood the protocols. They were not the kind of people who make a stupid, fatal mistake 60 feet below the surface. Whatever went wrong that day on St. Crispin's Reef, it wasn't their diving. On the morning of January 25th, 1998, Tom and Eileen boarded a commercial dive boat called the MV Outer Edge, run by a skipper named Jeffrey Nairn. Along with 24 other passengers, they cruised out of Port Douglas for a day trip to the Outer Reef. Standard commercial dive tourism, the kind of trip thousands of people do every year without incident. Around midday, the Outer Edge dropped anchor at St. Crispin's Reef, and the group went in. Tom and Eileen did what they'd done 100 times before. They kitted up, they slipped into the water, they descended, and they spent about 40 minutes exploring the coral. Then they came back up. And that, right there, is where their story ends and the nightmare begins. Because when Tom and Eileen surfaced, the MV Outer Edge was no longer floating above them. The boat had left. Now, here's what should have happened next. The boat had a head count protocol. When the Outer Edge got ready to pull anchor and head home to Port Douglas, the crew was supposed to count every single body that had come off the water and confirm it against the roster. 26 people had come out that morning. 26 people had to be on that boat to go home. Except the crew, in a fashion I still cannot quite believe when I read about it, somehow, according to their own version of events, counted 26 heads, even though only 24 were actually on board. Tom and Eileen were bobbing 40 miles behind them, and their head count came back clean. The boat sailed away. It's not even the most incredible part. Here's the most incredible part. When the Outer Edge got back to Port Douglas, Tom and Eileen's belongings were still on the boat. Their dry bags, their civilian clothes, their wallets, their shoes, everything, just sitting there. 2 full sets of clothes and passports with no owners, and nobody noticed, for 2 entire days. Let that sink in. For 48 hours, that boat is docked. Crew members are cleaning it, prepping it for the next trip, moving gear around, and nobody stops and says, "Hey, whose bag is this? Whose shoes are these? Where are the 2 people these belong to?" Only on January 27th, 2 days after the couple was left behind, did anyone finally connect the very obvious dots. And only then did the Australian Coast Guard scramble a massive air and sea search that by that point was almost certainly too late. The search went on for weeks, and in the days and weeks that followed, pieces of Tom and Eileen's dive equipment started washing up on beaches miles away. They found a buoyancy compensator, one of the vests divers wear to control their depth. They found a wetsuit, torn, and they found a dive slate. A dive slate is a small waterproof writing pad divers use to communicate underwater or to jot notes. On Tom's slate, when it was recovered, someone had written a message. It was a plea. A desperate, direct, "please come back for us" plea, written by 2 people who were still alive, still floating, still hoping that a rescue boat would appear on the horizon in time. No rescue boat ever did. Their bodies were never recovered. All right, let's pull the theories apart. Because in the aftermath of this disaster, some genuinely strange narratives got pushed into the public conversation, mostly by people who had a very specific interest in making sure this didn't turn into a story about corporate negligence. Theory 1 is really more of a question than a theory, but it's worth asking. The crew supposedly counted 26 heads. There were 24 people on the boat. How? How do you count 2 ghosts? And even setting that aside, how do you dock a boat, clean it, and prep it for the next trip while walking past a bag full of an American couple's clothes and passports for 2 days? That is not a mistake. That is a systemic breakdown of every single safety protocol a dive boat is supposed to have. And the only reason the industry got away with it as long as they did is because, historically, nobody ever surfaced to check. Theory 2. The intentional departure theory. Now this one is genuinely dark, because it wasn't just floated by internet weirdos, it was pushed by lawyers defending the boat company. Tom kept a diary. In some entries, the defense argued he wrote about his personal struggles with mental health and mortality. Those specific passages got leaked to the press, cherry-picked out of context, and angled in front of the public as evidence that maybe, just maybe, Tom and Eileen had orchestrated all this, that they'd deliberately hidden underwater until the boat left, planning never to return. But hold on. If Tom Lonergan wanted to die out there, why did he write a desperate plea for rescue on his dive slate? Why did they ditch their weight belts, which is what you do when you're actively trying to stay afloat? Why did Eileen's own diary, in the entries the defense conveniently didn't release, express her love for Tom, her excitement about their upcoming work in Fiji, her plans for the future? People who plan to voluntarily disappear usually leave a note. It doesn't leave a "come get us, we're still alive" scrawled in waterproof marker. This theory only ever existed to give a jury a reason to acquit somebody. It was a smear campaign against people who could no longer defend themselves. Theory 3. The faked death. Some people suggested that Tom and Eileen deliberately staged the whole thing to disappear into a new life. Okay, but think about what that requires. They were 40 miles off the coast of Australia. They didn't have their passports. Those were sitting in a dry bag on the boat that abandoned them. They didn't have money. They didn't have identification. Unless they had arranged for a private submarine to surface at exactly the right coordinates, the physical impossibility of walking away from that location, alive and untraceable, is basically infinite, which leaves the actual awful truth of what happened out on that reef. The evidence, the torn wetsuit, the ditched weight belts, the message on the slate, paints a very grim picture. Tom and Eileen surfaced, realized what had happened, and did all the right things. They stripped off weight so they could float. They stayed together. They wrote a message asking for help. And then they waited. In the sun, without water, with a horizon full of nothing. Marine biologists and search experts have generally concluded that they likely floated for at least a day, possibly longer, long enough to become severely dehydrated, long enough to burn under the sun, long enough maybe to write that message when they realized nobody was coming. Some believe they eventually drowned from exhaustion. Others suspect the torn wetsuit tells its own story and that the tiger sharks of the Coral Sea got to them at some point during that terrible drift. We will never know exactly, but we know it wasn't quick. Skipper Jeffrey Nairn was eventually charged with manslaughter and stood trial in Australia. He was ultimately acquitted. The prosecution couldn't clear the very high legal bar of proving criminal recklessness. But the dive operator pled guilty to negligence and was heavily fined. And the international outrage that followed the case, the sheer screaming "how does this even happen" of it, forced the Australian government to completely overhaul its maritime safety laws. Modern-day headcount procedures for dive boats, roll calls, active passenger tracking, a lot of it exists because of what happened to Tom and Eileen Lonergan on St. Crispin's Reef. Their story also became the loose inspiration for a horror movie you may have seen, the 2003 film Open Water. A couple left behind by a dive boat treading water, waiting for a rescue that never comes. The movie is fictional. What happened to Tom and Eileen was not. Two American Peace Corps volunteers, at the tail end of a life of service, went for a beautiful morning dive on one of the natural wonders of the world. They surfaced to an empty ocean. They wrote a message asking to be saved. They floated in a blue expanse the size of a country, and in the entire long, sunburned, terrified stretch of that final day, not a single person in the entire world, not the crew, not the skipper, not the port, not the Coast Guard, even knew they were missing.